There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be reading the first half of the second act, chapters 14 through 16. And the reading itself should take about the same time as last time, like roughly 2 hours. As always, you don't have to own a copy of the book in order to enjoy, but if you would like to buy yourself a copy to support the channel, there's a link in the description below or in the pinned chat message above. Also in the description below is my Substack, where I'm currently writing about the Great War, and I know it's been brought up earlier in the book, and it'll continue to be brought up throughout the book. The Great War was a big event that very much shaped the world of Astria. So I'm writing about that on my Substack, so you can find a link to my Substack in the description as well. I've been very, very happy reading the book the last couple of streams. So thank you to everyone who's been here live. It means a lot. And I will be doing this again with the second book when that's out. So, look forward to the second book and also look forward to those readings as well. Echo will once again be drawing our entertainment, as always, so feel free to thank her before we get started. And we will begin in 2 minutes. If you haven't gotten food already, go grab a snack. If you need to go get a blanket, go get a blanket. Get cozy. So we're in for another fun reading stream. Hello to everyone in the chat. Thank you for being here. What are we gonna get up to in these couple of chapters? I wonder. I'm very much looking forward to reading the second act. Thank you, Jazz. Thank you for the $2. It does make me smile. Can't see it, but I'm smiling. All right, 20 seconds. You better be ready. I'm not gonna be waiting much longer. All right. let's get started with the reading. Act 2, Mirage, Chapter 14. Amber's body becomes heavy, falling forward into Ethan's arms. The night reels backwards a good distance, its entire body erupting into mist. Ethan pauses to stare at it. He can see the violet rays shining from the helmet, and the weight of hopelessness sinks inside him. Ethan turns away from the reeling night and to the archway. The rip is open, revealing a tall, orange-yellow dune beyond, with hot air blasting in his face. Amber firmly in his grasp, he drags the both of them through the rip, still clutching the keystone tightly in his hand. Only once his feet hit warm sand is when he stops, breathing heavily from the weight he just carried. He looks up at the archway, this one tilted and sand-worn, and sees the rip snap shut, as Sandra, now a world away. He lets out a sigh of relief and let his legs collapse underneath him. He kneels in the warm sand, cape heavy on his shoulders, and hat casting his face in long shadows. Never did he think he'd need to use his cape, and yet he just did, saving Amber. He won't be forgetting the sight anytime soon. Her eyes bulging in surprise, the night just behind her, pulling the shadow from her body by the hair. It must have been incredibly painful for her. A pain she didn't deserve experiencing. He looks at the young wizard. She lies where he left her, just in front of the archway. She's breathing, but unconscious. Legs still aching, Ethan crawls over to her and places a hand on her forehead. Her skin is warm to the touch, burning as if she were sick. No doubt her shadow got damaged. Tearing a shadow from the head is always a bad idea. She won't be waking anytime soon. He decides to lay down next to her, just to catch his breath, and stares up at the sky above him, placing his hat and hands over his stomach. Stars twinkle in all their majesty, shining right back down on him. Though with the rising sun, they're starting to fade from view. The keystone in his hand grows cold, reminding him of its presence. It's a soft cream color, adorned with 2 interlocking circles, meaning balance or eternity. It brought the 2 of them to the desert island of Astria, Mirage. He's missed this island. The stars here are so vivid at night, as the desert has no other light around for as far as the eye can see. Just thinking about lying in the warm sand and stargazing the night away makes him feel slightly better inside. Though he's never actually explored Mirage in its entirety, nor has any sense of where any possible landmarks are in relation to the archway. Needless to say, he'd only wind up lost if he were to simply wander in a random direction. He sits up finally and gets to his feet, taking in his immediate surroundings. They're encompassed by high dunes on all sides, pretty much hiding the archway from view. It's either sandy shoes or bare feet, he thinks glumly. Readjusting his hat on his head, he attempts to climb up the nearest dune. The sand holds up surprisingly well, only giving way once or twice and causing him to stumble and slide. His shoes are completely filled with sand by the time he reaches the top, however. The grains rub between his toes uncomfortably, trapped there by his shoes. Maybe he should have taken them off. It's sand as far as the eye can see. The sun is just barely above the horizon, causing a bit of glare just off to his right. He has to raise a hand to keep himself from looking directly at it, not used to the presence of such a source of intense light. The sight makes his hopes fall. He doesn't want to turn around and go to another island. Not now. Then the chances of being found again will rise. Compared to Mirage, the other islands are small in comparison. It'd take too long to scour the sands of Mirage in one cycle, aside from, say, the dense forest of Gardal or the maze-like halls of gears and pipes of Kendon. But Amber... He turns to look back down at the archway. Amber continues to lay still, just a green and pink figure on the ground. They're going to need some shelter soon, with the Mirage sun on the rise. Though there is one idea he has to try. He closes his eyes and presses his palms together, close to his chest, to pray. Spirits of the white beyond, grant me your power, so that I may use it justly and to save the life of... He hesitates a moment. My friend, Amber. Thus, I call upon the aid of a spirit of fire. He remains still, waiting for any sort of reaction. He didn't exactly need to pray, yet he did it out of respect. It's the very first thing any death wizard learns above all else. And it's especially important to pay his respects now, since he and Amber aren't in any sort of immediate danger. Suddenly, a surge of magic rushes through his body, hot and blazing. Slowly, he opens his eyes to find flames spinning around his arms. The energy of fire magic is eagerness and determination, filling him with a sense of honor and dignity. Thank you, he mouths. He raises one of his arms to the sky, palm facing upwards and fingers spread. The flames around his arm collect in his palm in a single ball of fire. It takes just a mild mental nod towards the fireball to send it flying from his hand and into the air. He tilts his hat back with the same hand as he watches it travel high above him, slowly turning into a little red star. Eventually, once it runs out of energy, the ball bursts into smaller, glittering spheres of flame, which linger for a long moment before winking out of existence. There isn't any noise, yet the bright flare should be enough to draw attention. It isn't every cycle such a sight appears deep in the desert, no doubt. The fire magic drains from his body, the spirit retreating back into the white beyond, its job complete. It leaves Ethan with cold emptiness within, his own magic feeling thin and weak, as usual. He rubs his hands together and turns away from the sandy view. It will take any being a good long while to reach the archway, no doubt. Right now, he's got Amber to keep an eye on. The wind batters his face and whips through his light brown hair, and he welcomes it. The day hasn't become hot yet, for the sun is just starting to rise. But it's not too cold, either. The dunes streak past him as he travels, weaving around the hills with ease. The freedom he has right now is fleeting. Why not enjoy it to the fullest? Lucre spreads his arms wide and smiles up at the sky, remaining perfectly balanced on his sandboard as he does so. It's silver with green decal, and just big enough to fit both his feet on comfortably. It glides just above the sand with ease, kicking up a cloud behind him. His gray shirt and white sash rustles against his skin, blowing cool air up his back. Since he's sandboarding, he had to put on some shorts before leaving, but left his sandals behind. It's not that he doesn't enjoy his legs, but that using his tail would cause all sorts of balance and steering issues. When he turns away from his skyward grin, he spots something rise into the air over the dunes. A bright red light that flares and bursts, spawning smaller lights that slowly wink out and die. His eyes widen with surprise and curiosity. Who else would be out this deep in the desert at a time like this? The flare is small and seems pretty far away from where he currently is, though he's sure if he travels in the direction the flame came from, sooner or later he will stumble upon its source. It could be dangerous, nags at the back of Lucre's mind as he points himself in the direction of the flare. It could be dangerous, especially since the archway is somewhere around him. He doesn't exactly know who would be able to get to Mirage in the first place, but such a feat is not completely impossible to accomplish. Not for wizards. He tries not to give the flare much thought as he travels, still enjoying his time out on the sands. Mostly. He turns his head for a moment to stare at the dunes he passes. He extends a hand and lets his fingers skim the sides of the dunes, leaving behind little streaks as he goes. The sand doesn't sting his fingertips. On the contrary, it feels kind of nice. Time melts away until he finally reaches a ring of tall dunes, taller than the usual ones around him. So far, he's not seen anyone. Maybe he might see something if he climbs up there. He twists his board to the side and leans backwards, killing the board's momentum and kicking up a small cloud that attempts to batter his face, which he combats by simply turning away from it. With the board now stationary, he steps off, planting his feet firmly in the warm sand. He wiggles his toes playfully with a faint grin, then turns to pick up his board. It weighs almost nothing in his hands, with just a small ounce of mental effort. It crumbles away into sand itself. He'll summon it later when it's time to zoom off again. Lucre scrambles up the large dune on his hands and feet, a skill any Cerberus knows when it comes to traversing the sands on foot. It's easier to scale the dunes with a tail, yet these ones are angled to where using his tail would become more of a hindrance rather than a help. Best case scenario, it'd simply make him slip and fall back down. Worst case scenario, he could bring the dune down on top of himself. When he reaches the top of the dune, he pauses. Below, in what is essentially a hole of sorts, is the archway itself, with two figures crouched beside it. A girl, with bright pink hair and green-shaded clothes, her eyes closed, and her breathing even. And a boy, dressed all in black, with a wide hat and long cape that is splayed out behind him. He sits at the girl's side, seemingly watching over her as she sleeps. "Ah," escapes Lucre's mouth. And it takes a moment for him to register that it was him that spoke. It's been a good long while since he's heard his own voice. The single word is enough to draw the boy's attention, and he looks up at where Lucre perches. Soulless eyes as black as night pierce his own green ones, sending a chill down his spine. Cautiously, he starts to shuffle back down the dune. "Wait," the boy cries, causing Lucre to freeze. He watches the boy stand and start to approach the dune quickly, urgency in his step. Lucre feels his heart start to pound in his chest in panic. As a safety measure, he dips his hand into the dune and pulls out a long jade sword. Though light in his hand, all sand-made objects are pretty much weightless. It's still a very sharp and formidable weapon. "Stop!" he commands, springing up straight and pointing his sword down at the mysterious boy. He stalls at the base of the dune and stares up at Lucre, yet remains silent. He appears rather unconcerned about Lucre's weapon. Who... He grits his teeth, trying to find the right words to say. "It's okay," the boy speaks slowly, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I just need some help. I'm not going to hurt you." Lucre takes a moment to get his breathing under control. "Name?" he demands at last. "Ethan," the boy points at himself, and then to the girl. "Amber." "Why is... Amber..." Lucre pauses, cringing at his terrible pronunciation. "She's injured," Ethan says, paying no heed to his terrible speaking. Well, not for long, as he then raises an eyebrow and asks, "Do you not speak?" Lucre shakes his head. "Cerberus not speak much." "It's true," Cerberus normally talk with their body heat. They can regulate their temperatures to form pictures out of hot and cold spots, while also being able to see heat around them. So no, Cerberus do not speak much. Sometimes, but rarely, and normally when there isn't a clear picture for a certain word, or for clarification. Well, Lucre, is there anywhere we can stay? Shelter? Lucre doesn't know how to reply. There is shelter, far from here. If they need a healer, his home is pretty far for them to walk. If they just need a place to shield themselves from the sun, the old ruins are closer, though not by much. Injured. Want healer? Ethan takes a quick glance at Amber. Possibly. Are you wizards? Lucre asks quietly. Ethan doesn't respond, yet appears crestfallen. A nervous pit forms in Lucre's stomach. He shouldn't be helping wizards. He shouldn't even be talking to wizards. Please, Ethan says at last, just for a cycle or two. Lucre tilts his head in confusion. Cycle? When the sun goes up and down? Ethan does a little circle motion with a finger. That's a cycle. Oh, a day! You call it a day here. Lucre nods with a small grin. If they're looking for a day or two of rest, then maybe there's a Cerberus he knows who can house them. Or he could just leave the two here. It's the archway after all. They could probably go somewhere else. They don't need to stay on Mirage. And yet, if they could seek shelter elsewhere, then why haven't they left Mirage yet? Why take the time to send a signal and wait? Can you go? He asks. What, go to another island? Ethan echoes. Not exactly, no. Oh. So can you help us? Lucre furrows his brow and stares at the wizard long and hard. He doesn't want to say no. He really doesn't. If they have nowhere else to go and he just leaves the two here, with one of them being injured no less, then they most certainly wouldn't last long. But if he says yes, then he'd have to bring them home and somehow keep them a secret from the rest of his people. And if they're ever discovered, he doesn't want to think about that. Yes. Ethan grins up at him thankfully. Then he turns and strides back to Amber, crouching down next to her. Feeling the need to check on her as well, Lucre slides down the other side of the dune and slowly approaches the pair. Asleep? He asks. Seems like it, Ethan replies. With a grunt, he digs his arms under her and lifts her up, her serene face skyward. It's amazing how the sunlight doesn't wake her. He turns to the dunes around them with a troubled look. How in the stars am I supposed to climb those? I can push, Lucre offers. The wizard nods. Then let's give it a try. Lucre drops his sword, and it disappears into sand once again. He hates to be disarmed, and yet, so far, there hasn't been any hostility from the wizard. He seems to be more focused on getting care for Amber. How noble. He's going to need both hands for this. Ethan starts up the dune, Lucre following close behind him, his arms outstretched and waiting if he ever slips. And he does, a couple times, but it isn't anything too bad. Carrying a second person up the side of a dune must be hard, but with Lucre's help in catching him, the three make it up to the crest in no time at all. Now, where are we going? Ethan asks. Lucre simply points to where the sun is rising in response. From where they are, the village can't be seen, but it's over there, somewhere. Far, he mutters. Lucre slides down the dune again, planting his feet firmly in the sand below. He turns to look back up at Ethan, who stares down with mild worry. Lucre doesn't exactly know how to describe how best to slide down the dune, so he tries to demonstrate for him. Legs apart, one in front of the other, Bent knees, of course, with a slight lean backwards. With Amber in his hands, Ethan should have a little more trouble trying to balance out the backward lean, especially since he can't balance himself with his arms anyway. And still, the wizard appears unsure. Healer or no? Lucre asks. Ethan appears to let out a small, reluctant sigh and shakes his head. Then he takes a cautious step forward and begins to slowly shimmy his way down. It's some sort of half-slide, half-step, yet it appears to be working fairly well for him. Not as good as Lucre's slide, but it's not his place to judge right now. As Ethan gets his bearings at the bottom of the dune, Lucre bends down and digs his hands into the sand and focuses. He feels cold metal form in his palms, and slowly he lifts up his sandboard. Tossing it aside, he does the action again, drawing up a second board for Ethan to ride on. He puts the second board in front of the wizard, and gestures to it before hopping onto his own. Easy, Lucre assures the wizard calmly once he notices Ethan's uneasy staring. Slowly, the wizard places a foot on the front of the board, then quickly places a second on the back. The board dips ever so slightly, yet remains just barely above the sands. Though, maybe he'll need a push. How do I use this thing? Ethan mutters aloud, though probably to himself all the same, as he looks down at the board beneath him. Lucre clears his throat rather loudly, drawing the wizard's attention. Look. A lot of sandboarding relies on the back foot, mainly the heel. To start momentum, Lucre places his weight on his back foot, pushing the board down to touch the surface of the sand. As soon as the metal touches the ground, it bounces back up again, lurching him slowly forward. He shifts his back foot, angling his heel to the left, and slightly leans into it, sharply turning the board around to face Ethan. He slowly glides past the wizard and points to it down to his back foot. Heel steers. He glides around and passes him again on the other side, this time pointing to his front foot. Balance. Ethan nods along, seeming to understand the instructions being given, and then he gives it a try, bouncing off his back foot. The board jumps into the air, and Ethan makes a very audible inhalation of surprise. However, he seems to keep his balance on the board as he grips Amber at the same time. The board bobs a little bit before smoothly gliding forward. Lucre half grins and performs another bounce of his own, renewing his own board's momentum. He tries to go slowly, not gliding too high on the dunes to pick up speed, or getting too far ahead to where Ethan loses sight of him for more than a brief moment. Which is hard, because he's eager to get back home. Sooner or later, some being is going to notice that he's gone, and when that happens, he's going to get in massive trouble. How much farther? Ethan calls. Far, Lucre replies, finding it hard to keep himself from sounding anxious. Are you in a hurry? Yes. How come? Not... Lucre pauses to think, spelling out the sentence to himself before attempting to speak again. I am not allowed to sandboard much. Ethan remains silent behind him. Lucre turns to check and make sure that the wizard is still following. He is, though with a somber gaze towards Lucre himself. Lucre presses his mouth into a firm line and turns away again. No, he doesn't need to know. Eventually, the three leave behind the dunes and streak over a relatively flat plain of sand. Ethan spots a town just ahead, a collection of low buildings only a floor or two high, and made of some sort of sandy brick. He can see figures milling about between the buildings as well, and a few other Cerberus gliding around the outside of the town on the same silver board Lucre gave to him. Not supposed to go into the dunes. Lucre throws over his shoulder. Stay here. The Cerberus gestures to the large, flat expanse around them with both his hands, spinning them in large circles with palms pointed down at the ground. It certainly sounds like he's starting to warm up to speaking. So long as they can understand each other, Ethan doesn't mind the broken sentences too much. And that, Lucre points at the sky. Ethan follows, though what the Cerberus is showing him is fairly noticeable. Clouds in the distance. Dark, shadowy clouds. Been there for some time. Not harmful, but mysterious? Yes, mysterious. Ethan holds Amber close to him, readjusting his grip. His arms are starting to tire from supporting her weight for so long. He's seen those clouds before. Maybe they're not as safe on Mirage as he first thought. He follows Lucre close as he steers towards the outer buildings of the town. Eventually, he stops, turning his board sideways and leaning backwards to slow his momentum. Ethan opts for what he thinks is probably a better method of slowing down. He slips off his back foot and digs it into the sand, which does indeed bring him to an abrupt halt. However, the force causes him to stumble, and he begins to fall forward. He feels a being, possibly Lucre, quickly lift Amber from his arms as he tumbles to the sand. The grains batter his face and dig into his skin, making it burn. His eyes and mouth are closed, and yet he can feel the sand seemingly come alive and try to worm its way through his defenses. He pushes himself up quickly and sputters, wiping the sand off his face the best he can. Thankfully, much of the sand doesn't stick to his skin. Okay? Lucre asks. Ethan looks up at the Cerberus with a small grin. Lucre stares back in concern, Amber hanging in his arms. Yes, I'm fine, he replies simply. The response causes Lucre to smile along with him. Come, he urges. He turns and steps into a small alleyway, leaving behind the sandboards. As Ethan stands, he notices the boards slowly begin to dissolve into sand. It may be because of what sort of magic Lucre used to make them. His sword did seem to magically disappear without him noticing earlier, too. He follows Lucre down the alleyway, keeping his guard up. There's little reason for the Cerberus to turn against him and Amber. He seems like a very compassionate being from the start, if not a little timid. But almost anything can happen at this point. He has to be ready for anything. Wizards not liked here, Lucre says quietly. Ethan nods, though the Cerberus can't see the motion. Okay. But wizards are easy to spot. Oh? Cerberus talk with bodies. Lucre briefly laughs at his own sentence. Ah, heat? Yes, body heat. We can see heat. You can communicate through watching each other's body heat? Ethan clarifies. Yes, sorry. Words and mouth. Lucre gives a small shrug. You'll learn, Ethan replies. Maybe. The Cerberus stops outside a wood-like door tied together with some sort of vine-looking rope and turns to Ethan. Take? Ethan nods and reaches out for Amber again. Once she is back in his grasp, Lucre knocks on the door. Almost instantly, the door flies open. In the doorway is a rather elderly Cerberus, with silver-white hair, bright orange eyes, and a dark brown tail swishing behind her. Her upper torso is clothed in nothing but a single dusty shirt, full of holes and tears at every opening. Underneath is a cleaner, whiter shirt, though that also seems to be slowly deteriorating. His eyes start to Lucre's outfit in an instant. The boy's gray shirt appears to be some sort of wrap, held together by a white sash and belt, with nearly non-existent sleeves and a bright yellow hem that glitters like gold. What a stark difference of dress. Anassi! Lucre says happily, though that's about as friendly as the conversation seems to get. Anassi scowls down at Lucre, who stares back at her with a very pleading expression. Both their eyes flicker left, right, up, and down, seemingly reading what Ethan presumes to be each other's body heat. But Lucre speaks, panic in his voice, drawing Ethan's attention back to the two Cerberus. Anassi is shaking her head, her eyes closed. Lucre bites his bottom lip, his expression downhearted. Then he turns away, the conversation appearing done and over with. No, please, Ethan tries, drawing Anassi's attention to him. Just for a day or two, or until my friend wakes up. Yes, we can leave when she wakes up if you want. Just let us stay. Anassi's face crinkles and shifts from a frown into something that appears to be mild confusion and, quite possibly, sympathy. She probably wasn't expecting Ethan to plead with her. If he could have, he'd probably have gotten down on his knees and begged. He might as well do that now. It'd get Amber out of his arms for a little bit. Eventually, Anassi lets out a reluctant sigh. Fine. Come. She moves out of the doorway and gestures for them to enter. Ethan steps in first and finds himself in a small room with just a single table and one chair, made out of thin gray logs and planks of wood, and held together with the same vine-like rope that has also been used on the front door. A small pit of ash and small twigs sit to one of the far sides of the room, with a small red clay pot set just next to it. A small staircase at the back leads upwards to a second floor, quite possibly where Anassi sleeps at night. The temperature inside the little house is the same as outside, for the windows are just holes in the wall rather than actual windows, and it doesn't help that Ethan is currently dressed in mostly black clothing. Amber's body must also be starting to overheat because of her robe's long sleeves and pants. Wizard attire isn't exactly for hot weather. Up, Anassi hisses behind him. Bed for her. Thank you. Ethan nods to her. He makes his way across the room, careful not to bump Amber into the table as he passes it, nor have his own foot kick the pot next to the fire pit. He makes his way up the stairs, needing to let Amber sag in his arms to make sure she fits comfortably in the small stairwell. The stairs themselves have many of their rush edges smoothed over, possibly from years and years of Cerberus slithering up and down them with their tails, though it's hard for him to watch his step with Amber blocking most of his downward view. He reaches the second floor and scans the room. It's much like the room below, with a small gray wood table and bed, and 4 windows, one square hole in the middle of each wall. The bed itself is covered in nothing but a single ragged sheet, the same dusty off-white color as Anassi's top shirt, and just as ragged. There's no padding underneath the sheet, or even a pillow to rest one's head on. Reluctantly, Ethan sets Amber on top of the sheet and fumbles with the clasp of his cape. The clasp clicks, and he brings the long piece of black fabric around and wraps it loosely around his arm. Once this is done, he slips it off his arm and lifts Amber's head to place it under her as a sort of makeshift pillow. She'll awaken stiff, sore, and even hot and sweaty, but at least she's got something for her head. Everything okay? Ethan turns to see Lucre standing in the stairwell, not quite at the top, yet with only his upper body in full view. Ethan musters a thankful grin for the young Cerberus. Yes, thank you. Lucre smiles back. Take care. And with that, he is gone. Chapter 15. Something cold and sweet trickles down Amber's throat, bringing life back to her lips and mouth. Slowly, as she licks the substance, the sensation blooms outwards with a rush. It fills her arms and legs with energy, swirls around her beating heart, and brings life back to her face. She opens her eyes to two strange beings staring down at her. One, the older one, with bright orange eyes, is holding their hand over her face, though reels her hand back once Amber shows signs of life. Another is a boy with a blackish scar over his left eye. He seems strangely familiar. "Amber," he says, his face lighting up with relief. He leans forward, just in front of the old woman, as if to get a better look at her. With a groan, Amber sits up. Her limbs protest the movement, the cool and revitalizing sensation fading into a warm and sticky stiffness. Her head pounds painfully. She grits her teeth and inhales sharply, lungs burning. "Hey, take it easy," the boy says, placing a hand on her back to support her. Amber takes a moment to collect herself through all the pain, then turns to the boy and asks simply, "Do I know you?" The boy seems taken aback by the question, his eyes widening in what she believes is either shock, surprise, or both. "Come on, Amber, you don't recognize me?" the boy asks. Amber shakes her head slightly. Ethan Nightshade?" Again, she shakes her head. "We attend the same school." "Which one?" she asks. "The Sandra School of Magic, ASM." "I don't think I know that place." Ethan scowls in frustration and turns away from her, first grabbing something behind her before standing and walking towards the middle of the bare room. He seems to fiddle with whatever he had just retrieved for a moment before shaking his head. Amber turns to the woman and almost immediately notices her brown tail. And you are?" "Anasi," the woman replies, partially drawing out the S in her name. Anasi reaches into a small brown pouch that rests in one of her hands and withdraws a small blue pebble. She holds it out to Amber. "Bite." Amber takes the pebble and pops it in her mouth. It's tasteless, just a little rock rolling around on her tongue. She follows Anasi's instruction and bites it. The pebble is easily crushed between her teeth, and from it explodes cold water. Caught off guard, Amber holds a fist to her mouth to prevent herself from spewing. Then she swallows and lets out a gasp for air. "Water pellet," Anasi says as she ties a small string around the top of the pouch. She turns and slithers past Ethan, still standing with his back turned to Amber, tail swishing as she goes. Then she turns and slowly descends to a lower level, out of sight. Finally, Ethan turns back around, and Amber sees a mass of black cloth balled in his hands. This time he wears a worried expression. "What do you remember?" he asks her. Amber shrugs and shakes her head. "A flash? Everything before that is hazy at best." "Seriously?" She nods. "What happened to me?" Ethan presses his lips closed, his eyes glazing over. Seems like whatever he's thinking of blocked out her question. "Ethan?" His name brings his focus back to her, and his expression softens with a slight exhale through his nose. "What happened to me?" Ethan lets out a small sigh and hangs his head. "An attack. We were trying to escape, but you got grabbed. You were knocked out, so I carried you all the way here." "Who?" "Not important," he snaps abruptly. "But Ethan—" Ethan shoots her an angry glare. Amber takes a hesitant breath as his stare bores into her. "I think I deserve an explanation," she says. Ethan continues to stare for a long moment, and Amber almost feels like taking back what she just said. And yet, before she can speak again, Ethan hangs his head and lets out a sad sigh. "I guess you're right," he mutters. He unfurls the fabric in his hands and swishes it around his back, clicking a silver clasp in place just under his neck. He had been holding a large, billowy cape. He grabs the edges of his cape and draws them close to his body, almost as if he were to wrap himself up inside it. When he looks up, there's barely a flicker of life in his eyes as he gives her a solemn and tired look. I had this friend a long time ago. She was a brilliant spiritist, but didn't grow up at the best time. Her parents didn't support her, she had no friends, and was ostracized in school. When I met her, her mind wasn't in the right place. And she had my sibling do some pretty bad things over the last couple 1,000 years. How old are you then? Amber breathes. Me specifically? Only 1,800, roughly. Otherwise, a lot older than that. I can't even give an estimate at this point. Anyway, this former friend of mine decided to have my sibling pull a rather ridiculous stunt recently. This would be better if you were familiar with the theory of life and death, but he shakes his head before continuing. How a living being is made is with a shadow, a spirit, and husk. The shadow is like your magic personified. It's other things as well, like how you're able to move and have unique physical features. The spirit is your personality. And the husk is this. He simply gestures to himself. Your hair color and eye color and your physique. It's like a house for your shadow and spirit to live in. Without your spirit, you become an emotionless puppet. Without your husk, you die. And without your shadow, your body cannot function. So, my sibling was forced to steal some beings' shadows. It was trying to go after yours as well, but I stopped it. Sadly, I stopped it a little too late. Your shadow suffered some damage to the head. No doubt that's why you've lost your memories. But if you didn't step in, then we wouldn't even be talking? Amber asks. Pretty much, Ethan nods. He raises a hand and rubs the back of his head, his eyes straying to the floor. Look, I'm sorry about all this, but it's okay. Amber steps in, mustering an encouraging smile. Everything will come back to me eventually, right? I guess so, Ethan eventually mutters. In an effort to get her mind off of her missing memories, Amber stands from the bed and brushes off her robe, then wipes her brow with her sleeve. It sure is hot. Where are we? She asks, looking out the nearest window at all the low buildings around them. Mirage, the desert island, Ethan replies simply. I was led to this house by a Cerberus called Lucre. If we ever run into him again, I'll be sure to point him out so you can thank him. He was a big help. I'm sure he was, Amber chuckles. Lucre is a very nice name. And Nasi helped to heal you. Oh. Just then, Anasi's head pops into view from the stairwell, her expression a half-smile. Food? Her sudden voice makes Ethan visibly jump and turn around in surprise. Yes, please, Amber replies. I guess some food wouldn't hurt, Ethan breathes. Amber first. The two slowly walk down the narrow steps to the ground floor. A single clay bowl sits in the center of a table in the middle of the room, full of a variety of fruit Amber has never seen before. Despite her current memory issues, nothing seems familiar to her. Anasi sits on her tail next to the table, already munching on a purple-skinned fruit. Fruit? Ethan asks from behind, trying not to sound too disrespectful, but definitely a little irate at the sight. That's it? Anansi frowns at him. All we grow, wizard. Ethan, thank her for the food, Amber chides. Ethan clenches his jaw for a moment, then lets out a sigh. Sorry, thank you. The two approach the table and take a fruit from the bowl each. Amber finds herself staring down at one that is red and somewhat round, with a little brown stem poking out the top. Apple, Anansi says to her simply, then turns to Ethan, who is inspecting a red, yellow, and brown striped fruit. Jamba Amar. This is Jamba? Ethan mutters in surprise. It's got the same shape. How do I open it? Anansi holds her hand out, and Ethan hands her the fruit without hesitation. The Cerberus clutches the fruit tightly in both her hands, and sharply slams it against the edge of the table. Crack! The fruit splits open with ease, some juice squirting out and staining the wood with dark gray droplets. Inside, the fruit is a pale red-brown color. She casually hands the two halves back to Ethan. Thank you, he says, sounding a little shaken. He stares down at the halves for a moment, then tries to take a bite out of the fruit. Almost immediately, his body jerks backwards, and his arms extend the fruit away from his face. Ah! Blech! Bitter, Jamba. Anansi chuckles. Now you say it, Ethan grumbles. Maybe you shouldn't have been so rude, Amber teases lightly. She bites into her apple, which is crunchy, yet very sweet and full of flavor. The juice is cool and refreshing, especially so in such a hot climate. This apple isn't so bad. We grow many fruits, Anansi says to her. All we have here. Is it because of the environment? Amber asks. The elderly Cerberus nods. No wonder, Ethan hums aloud. Those clouds, Ethan says to Anansi, partly leaning on the table. What do you know about them? The Cerberus swishes her tail, and her expression turns into a frown of thought. In her hands, she holds a half-woven basket of sorts, which she had retrieved from somewhere outside not too long ago. The material is some sort of flat and dull yellow plant part, maybe a leaf, like aged paper. Amber is back upstairs resting. He hopes that some sleep will do her head some amount of good. The sooner she gets her memories back, the better. Been there... Anansi pauses and lets out a low hum. A few days? Came from nowhere. Blocks out morning sun. And nothing happened at all since? Anansi shakes her head. Not here. Palace. Bad things. Dark things. Ethan lets out a deep breath and bows his head. So it's as he feared. You know? Anansi asks. I am afraid I do, he replies quietly. He shakes his head. I can't say much, though. You're already at risk from your own people if we are ever discovered here. I'd rather not add to your danger. He lifts his head again and forces a thankful grin. Thank you, by the way. Whenever you want us to leave, we will. Anansi lets out an amused huff and smiles back, flashing her long fangs at him. Not the first Lucre asked me to take risks. Not the last, either. There's a moment of pause between them. Do all Cerberus sound like you? Ethan asks hesitantly. Anansi nods, her gaze dark and distant. Spoken is dying. With a sigh, the Cerberus sets aside her weaving, having hardly worked on it at all. Her tail lowers her body as it spirals outwards, creating a loose coil around her. The brownness of the tail slowly fades as the tail grows short and splits in two. Pretty soon, she's sitting with crossed legs, the skin tan and withered with age. She places her hands on the ground and pats it, possibly inviting Ethan to join her. Slowly, he plops himself on the stone ground in front of her and folds his hands in his lap. Once, Anansi recounts slowly, picking her words carefully. It was common. Aside from our bodies, it was how we conversed. With family, with friends, with others. Then after the war, we closed the island to outsiders. It became an art, a test of smarts. But it quickly faded into irrelevance. There are other reasons as well, but the big one is that we do not need it anymore. Magic is similar. With the war went our best shamans. They taught the young ones magic, but now that is lost. Magic is not used much here. When we do, it can be wild. We have ways to control it, but even then it is unrefined. The wizards left you all this way? And Essie nods. They offered no help. We were left with only our spring. This place, she gestures with one hand at the room around them, is not old. Excuse me? The ancestors became upset, and the old spring ran dry. It was big, enough for twice the people we have now. We were forced to move, and our numbers have been shrinking since. Ethan's eyes widen. So the Cerberus are having water problems? Normally such a thing is an easy fix, and yet... Anansi said it herself. They are unskilled with magic and can't control it. Even if they had any ice users among their people, which they surely have none of due to the fact that they're having this water shortage, they'd probably not be able to use the magic as effectively as a proper ice wizard from Asandra can. Maybe it'd even end up doing the Cerberus harm. Spoken also dries the body faster, Anansi adds with a weary grin. You don't need to keep talking if you don't want to. My apologies. Ethan stands and brushes his robe. Anansi's legs morph back into her tail, and she, too, rises from the ground. She slides over to a small ledge poking out of the wall, where the water pellet bag sits. Stay as you need, she says, popping a pellet into her mouth. He hears the crunch and watches her swallow and replace the bag. But I have only so much to give. Restrictions. To keep Cerberus happy and healthy. Ethan nods. I understand. You were down there quite a while, Amber comments as Ethan rises from the stairwell. The wizard chuckles weakly. Yes, well, me and Anansi had some things to discuss. How long have you been awake? Not long, Amber replies with a small yawn. What were you talking about? Just Mirage for the most part. Ethan takes a seat on the ground beside her bed and leans up against the wall, his gaze distant. There's shadow on the horizon. What? You can see it from here. He points to the window across from him. The clouds. My friend got here before us. I don't know why. What's her name? Ethan shifts uncomfortably. He is silent for a long time, staring blankly at the opposite wall and ignoring her gaze. Riona, he whispers. As if it were spoken louder, she would magically appear before him. Have I? She's not been seen in many thousands of years. Ethan cuts her off quickly. No, it's no being you know. Amber is still, simply staring at him more intensely. He sure seems to hold a lot of resentment towards this Briona person. Ethan shakes his head. I don't know why she's got an interest in Mirage, but she's been causing some problems here. Granted, the Cerberus have their own issues already. They don't deserve whatever she's doing to them. What is she doing? I don't know, he exclaims loudly. His eyes snap to her, anger blazing. I stopped knowing a long time ago. Do you know how frustrating that is, not knowing anything? You should, since you're the one who doesn't know anything anymore. He stands and walks over to the window, arms folded. I was just asking. Amber mutters quietly. Her body shakes with nervousness and shame. She didn't mean to anger him. She just wants some answers for once in her life. Then again, he probably wants some too. The two were silent for a long time. The air between them is full of tension. Ethan stares out the window at the rest of the town. Amber opts to remain in bed. She reaches for his cape. He gave it to her earlier to use as a pillow, and hugs it close to her chest. She squeezes with all her might, channeling her feelings into it. She doesn't dare to speak. What if he shouts at her again? What if he... She inhales sharply at her own thoughts. What if he ends up hitting her? Ethan lets out a deep sigh that causes her body to stiffen. I shouldn't have said that, he says. Sorry. Amber takes a deep breath. Should she respond? Is he expecting her to respond? She looks down at the bed and doesn't speak. How are your memories doing? Again, she takes a deep breath, hesitant to answer. Sleeping did help as he thought it would. Some have started to return to her, scattered and hazy, but frighteningly vivid, all the same. But what little she is able to remember, she doesn't want to think about. Amber? His voice is quiet now. Her blood runs cold as she senses his stare lay upon her. They're coming back. Slowly. She forces. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? The memory surges forward. A boy, Blaze, towers over her, even though he isn't looking at her. And he raises a hand and gestures towards her, saying bitterly, See? She's just useless. She just squeezes her eyes shut and shakes her head. After a quiet moment, she feels an arm wrap around her shoulders. Ethan doesn't speak, instead just holding her. With a sniff, she rests her head on his shoulder, tears beginning to stream down her face. She doesn't want to cry. Not here. Not now. Not like this. I'm sorry, he mutters. It doesn't make her feel any better, but... It's Blaze, isn't it? Amber lifts her head and attempts to wipe her face dry. Still, a couple tears fall. She looks at Ethan, her brow knitted tightly. How did you... Ethan shrugs. I just assumed you had led a very average life until... that. Amber nods her head back at him, mostly out of instinct. Nothing else? She shakes her head. Maybe if I sleep a little more? Ethan half grins. Resting always helps, especially for life wizards. He turns to glance out the window once again. Well, it's still about mid-cycle, but it's not like we can go anywhere anytime soon anyway. Why? Wizards aren't welcome here. I imagine we'll be punished if we're ever caught, along with Anassi, and maybe even Lucre. Oh. Don't worry. We should be fine, for a little while at least. He rubs his hands together and hums to himself. How about a game? As soon as game is spoken, Amber perks up a bit. At least it'll get her mind off of... She smiles. What sort of game? With or without your memories, you've probably never heard of this one, Ethan says. He holds out a hand in front of him, and in a puff of black smoke, 2 little boxes appear in his palm, one on top of the other. It's called Snap. Normally, it's played in a larger group, but we can do it by ourselves. Here, take a look. He hands her one of the boxes. Amber takes it and finds one end already open, full with something. She tilts the box, and out slides numerous gray rectangles with colorful images. These are playing cards, Ethan continues, sliding out his own cards into his other hand. Each one has a different amount of images, either circles or diamonds, and they're either white or black to represent light and shadow. There are 15 numbers and 4 pictures, being officer, commander, knight, and champion. He turns over the cards one by one and places them on the bed. The officer is a person holding a bow, a quiver at their hip, and dressed in plain clothing. The commander dons armor and a spear, standing at attention. The knight... A sharp pain ignites in Amber's head, and she winces. Is something wrong? Ethan asks her. The knight, she mutters, eyeing the card. The knight wears white armor from head to toe, a long golden tassel swishing from the helmet. They have their hands folded over the hilt of a longsword, the tip resting level with their feet. It looks familiar. It probably should. Ethan sighs. That's who attacked us earlier. See? He hunts for another card and slides it over the white knight. This one wears the same armor, with the same sword and golden tassel, and yet the white armor is now as black as night. Amber looks away from it and holds her head in her hands. It throbs painfully. She can feel her heartbeat in her ears, making them ache and pop. Pain. Pain is the first thing that comes to mind. Something yanking on her hair, pulling her head backwards. A burning sensation around the base of her neck, so hot it feels deathly cold. And that flash of light. She hears Ethan shuffling the cards around, and she forces herself to look up. The knights are gone. This is the champion, he says simply, sliding the last picture card forward. It's similar to the knight, except that the armor is twice as big and fancy. The helmet makes the head look small compared to the rest of the body. They hold a sword and shield close to their chest, a flowing cape billowing behind them. The rules are simple. Each player places a card out in front of them. If one card has a higher value than the other, then the winner places their card at the bottom of their stack, and the loser puts theirs in their discard pile. The one who still has cards to play wins overall. And if the cards are the same value, each player draws again until one gets a higher value. Color doesn't matter. He holds out a hand to her. Give me your cards. Reluctantly, Amber hands her stack over to him. Ethan starts quickly thumbing through them. We won't play with the knight for right now. She nods. Thank you. He finally withdraws 2 cards and sets them aside, careful not to show them to Amber. She knows what they are already. Then he puts her deck back together and returns them. Go on and shuffle them. She takes them and pauses for a moment, looking at him and wondering what a shuffle is. He gives her no attention and focuses on his own deck, taking a couple cards from the bottom and wiggling them back into the stack. That's probably what he meant. Amber slowly shuffles her deck as well, mimicking his actions as best she can. Though the wiggling part is hard at times, with the cards often ending up getting stuck on one another and making her life a little more difficult. However, she doesn't want to force them to slide together and possibly ruin them. She doesn't even know where he got them from. After a while, she deems her deck thoroughly shuffled, and she scoots back on the bed to give the 2 of them a little more room to play. Ethan places his deck in front of him, picture side down, and looks at her expectantly. She does the same. Just take the top card and place it in front of you, like this. Ethan slides the top card off his stack and places it picture up in front of it. He smiles weakly. Ah, 1 of shadow. Well then. Amber chuckles and reveals her top card. That's, 5 of shadow. Ethan shrugs. Well, you win this one. You can take your card and put it at the bottom of your stack. He shows off the winning action with his own card, though quickly removes it and sets it aside, picture up. But I lost, so I have to discard mine. And then we go again. Amber takes her card and places it at the bottom of her stack, just as she was shown. Simple enough. They go again. Ethan draws a 6 of light, and Amber a 4 of shadow. Is this game not popular? Amber asks. It's old, Ethan replies simply. 5 of light and 3 of light. How old? All the way back to the Great War. 3 of shadow and 5 of light. Was the war 2,000 years ago? Ethan pauses for a moment, card hovering in the air, and laughs. No, of course not. He places an officer of light. Amber stares dejectedly at her 1 of shadow. When did it happen? She asks. Long time ago. No being knows exactly how long. Not even me. So how did you learn this game? My father taught me. 13 of shadow and 10 of shadow. You have family? In a sense. It's complicated. How so? 7 of light and officer of light. Well, I'm more like a half-sibling, but I'm directly related to one who is also directly related to the rest of the family. How does that work? Ethan scowls down at his cards, thinking. 14 of light and 14 of light. Ah, here we go, he muses. He draws another card and places it atop his 14. It's a 6 of shadow. Amber does the same and reveals a 1 of light. Tough luck, Ethan chuckles, placing his 2 cards under a stack. Amber lets out a small hum and moves her own cards to her discard pile. You didn't answer my question. Do I have to? I'd like it if you did. How do I even begin? 9 of shadow and 10 of light. Well, my sibling is a shadow. Amber pauses and looks up at him. What? Ethan looks back at her, his expression dead serious. My sibling is a shadow. What does that even mean? Ethan lets out a sigh. There are 2 types of shadows. 11 of light and 3 of shadow. One is a regular shadow, like yours. The other is called a fragment shadow. Fragment shadows, or just fragments, Commander of Shadow and 11 of Shadow, are created by the spirit of Shadow. There is a spirit of light as well. The 2 of them created the universe, the beings, and the magic we practice. 3 of light and 2 of shadow. As for me, I belong to a fragment, therefore making me a half-sibling to the others. There's more than one fragment shadow? Many more. 13 of light and 13 of shadow. So, you're just a husk, then? Amber places her card down, an officer of shadow, and looks up at Ethan. His body is visibly tense, his eyes frozen on the cards between them. Slowly, he looks up at her, and his empty yet surprised stare sends a chill down her spine. Did she say something wrong? After a long silence, Ethan lets out a heavy sigh and wordlessly places his card down in front of him. 4 of light. It takes Amber a moment to register that she has the higher card. Yes, I'm just a husk, he finally admits, sliding his cards into his discard pile. He almost sounds ashamed to admit such a fact aloud. So, how were you able to, move? She asks. No wonder she found his eyes so lifeless and unnerving. That's because he's just an essenceless body masquerading as a living being. Ethan shakes his head reluctantly in response. It's a long story. 2 of light and 8 of light. Can you give the short version? That's kind of impossible. How come? It involves Riona. A lot. 9 of light and 6 of shadow. Amber stares at her dwindling stack of cards for a moment. Ethan sure is good at this game. You wouldn't understand without the full context, Ethan continues, moving to draw another card. Can you tell me anyway? Maybe some other time. 5 of shadow and 12 of light. I miss it, though. Miss who? Shadow. What? That's its name. Shadow. Ethan chuckles. Creative, I know, but it insisted. 4 of shadow and 4 of light. It's been a while since I've seen it, he muses aloud. 8 of shadow and 2 of light. He exhales slowly as he moves his cards around. Well, I've seen it, but not. He shakes his head and amends with, Shadow isn't who it once was. I want to see the old Shadow again. You 2 were close. Ethan lets out an amused chuckle. Of course we were. Ten of light and champion of light. I guess that's the simplest way to put my existence, he comments. Shadow was lonely, so it made me. That's kind of sad. It is. 15 of light and 12 of shadow. We played Snap a lot, actually. Really? Ethan smiles. It went a lot faster than this. Who won most of the time? It was about half and half. 7 of Shadow and 7 of Shadow. 15 of Shadow and 9 of Light. Amber slides the 2 cards into her discard pile with a sigh. No wonder you're so good. He rolls his eyes with a slight smile. I think I'm just lucky. She lets out a skeptical huff. Sure you are. 12 of Light and 6 of Light. And what about the war? What do you mean? What was it? Ah. Officer of Shadow and Commander of Light. It was about the wizards and the guardians of old, to put simply. Guardians? Once, Astria was covered in a vast ocean. 2 of Shadow and 7 of Light, which turned into what we know as the Void. The Guardians made ships to travel across this ocean, and weapons of all sorts. But the one thing they didn't know was magic. 8 of Light and 8 of Shadow. 1 of Light and 14 of Shadow. Which is where wizards come in. The first wizards were blessed with one of 7 magics, although only 6 of them have been passed on through the generations after the war's end. He pauses for a moment, closing his eyes to recall something important. There's a popular saying. From light there is life, from shadow there is death, with time but only an illusion. Our history is preserved in ice, our dignity burns as bright as a fire, and our strength is greater than that of a single storm. That's a little long, isn't it? Amber comments with a slight smile. Well, it used to be much longer back then, Ethan chuckles. While the use of magic has grown mundane in recent times, when it was first bestowed, it was indeed a blessing to all of Astria. But in the years leading up to the war, it was twisted into a curse. Champion of Light and 13 of Light. What happened? The Guardians got scared. The spirit of light instilled fear and paranoia into them, saying that the wizards would usurp their powerful grip over Astria. So, in retaliation, they started to kill the wizards. In secret, of course. They knew there would be outrage if they were ever found out. And the spirit's so-called champion, he holds up his Champion of Light card, was the worst out of all of them. But the wizards found out in the end? 10 of Shadow and Commander of Shadow. Oh, they were furious, Ethan nods. Or so I was told. You weren't there. I was... Shadow was made after the war ended. Oh. Commander of Light and 9 of Shadow. The wizards wanted vengeance. Simple as that. And that's how the war started. So, this is a Guardian game. Yeah. 11 of Shadow and Champion of Shadow. Do other wizards know how to play? Maybe at one point, but the resources that we have are better spent on other things instead of playing cards. Where did you get these cards then? 12 of Shadow and 15 of Light. I created them. You made them yourself? Creation is a principle of shadow magic, yes, but I can't do it much. 14 of Shadow and 11 of Light. But you can still make cards. It's pretty much all I can do. Anything I create needs a constant flow of magic to sustain it. Without shadow, there's very little I can do. Because the shadow is the essence of magic. Ethan laughs brightly. Yes, it is. Champion of Shadow and 15 of Shadow. I believe we're back to the cards we have used before. Amber blinks. You can tell? Of course I can. She looks down at her small stack compared to Ethan's. I think you won. Not until one of us runs out, he replies with a sly smirk. He puts forward his next card. Amber, with a sigh, does the same. 6 of light and 5 of shadow. Amber rolls her eyes. 5 of light and 5 of light. Officer of light and officer of light. The two were moving faster now. 13 of shadow and 10 of light. 14 of light and 13 of shadow. 6 of shadow and officer of shadow. Snap, snap, snap goes the cards as they slam them down. 11 of light and 8 of light. Commander of shadow and 12 of light. 3 of light and champion of light. 9 of light and commander of light. 4 of shadow and 7 of light. Amber's stare grows intense. The only thing she is aware of are the cards before her, watching the numbers. She barely even registers her hand movements. 8 of shadow and 8 of shadow. 15 light and 14 shadow. 11 shadow and commander shadow. 15 shadow and champion shadow. 12 light and 15 light. She's gotten rid of a few of Ethan's leftover cards. Maybe I can still win this. Champion light, officer shadow, commander light, champion light, 14 shadow, commander light, 6 light, commander shadow, 5 light, champion shadow, officer light, 15 shadow, 13 shadow, champion light, 14 commander, 11 commander, commander, champion, 8 champion, 15 commander, champion, commander, champion of shadow, and champion of shadow. Amber pauses, her breathing heavy. She glances up at Ethan, who is also taking deep breaths. The two stare at each other in silence, not one of them moving. They're both down to their last 3 cards. They both have 2 champions. What if we're left with only champions? Amber asks. Then it's a tie, Ethan replies. Officer and champion. Ethan lets out a low growl as he slides his officer into his discard pile. Champion and commander. Amber sighs, and her shoulders relax. She didn't even notice how tense she had gotten. Ethan runs a hand through his hair and stares down at the cards, also releasing a blow of air. That was a decent first game, he says, finally looking up with a grin. Well done. Thank you, she chuckles. I guess I got lucky. You did make a good comeback at the end there. I thought I was going to lose. It may have turned out that way, but it didn't. Amber moves to start shuffling her deck. Want to go again? Ethan shrugs. Sure. Chapter 16. Lucre stares up at the second floor of the house. He can hear something snapping up there. It's sharp and quick and rhythmic. What in the sands? Anassi opens the door, finally, its slight creaking catching his attention. Good morning, Lucre. Anassi grins. He smiles back. Hi, Anassi. Thanks again for looking after those wizards for me. Are you here to see them? Yep. Is the girl awake? She has been for a while now. She roused yesterday, not long after you left. Lucre looks back up again. What's going on up there? He would have liked to continue staring, but then he wouldn't see Anassi's reply. He turns back to the elderly Cerberus to find that she hasn't started her reply yet. She was probably waiting on him. I don't know, but it sounds like they're having fun, Anassi says at last. She shifts out of the doorway and waves him inside. He passes the dining table and fire pit quickly, heading directly to the stairs. He thought it'd be best to check on the 2 wizards before he went out sandboarding. He pops his head up to find the two half sitting on the bed, waving around flat white objects. They slam them down on the wood, each time producing that snap he heard from outside. Both are focused on the objects, sliding them around before slamming more down. Are they playing a game? He doesn't want to interrupt them, so he watches quietly from the stairwell, resting his chin on the floor as he stares. Eventually, Amber throws her hands up with a triumphant, "Yes, I win!" "Ah, so it is a game." Ethan just smiles along and claps. "Good job." Amber bends over, probably collecting her white things. Ethan starts to do the same, but pauses and looks over at the stairs. "Lucre!" he exclaims in surprise. Amber pauses and follows Ethan's gaze. The moment she lays eyes on Lucre, she jumps in surprise. Lucre smiles. "Hello." He places his hands on the floor and uses them to lift himself up out of the stairwell. "How are you?" "We've been fine," Ethan replies, gesturing to Amber. "She's been recovering?" Amber nods. "Ethan told me you helped us get here the other cycle. Thank you." Lucre just chuckles and rubs the back of his head, unsure how to properly reply. She stares back at him with bright, silvery eyes, the likes of which he's never seen before. Then again, he's never seen wizards until yesterday. "I will sandboard now," he tells them. "Want to come?" Amber tilts her head. "Sandboard?" "It's pretty fun," Ethan tells her. "It's how we got here last cycle. Want to give it a try?" Amber nods. "It'll be good to stretch our legs. Besides," she claps, and a burst of golden sparkles shimmer into existence. "I've not actually seen Mirage yet." "Then come," Lucre beams, turning back to the stairwell. He doesn't even bother going around and walking down the steps like a normal Cerberus. Instead, he crouches down and half jumps down to the steps below. He turns to check if the other wizards are following. "I'll clean up the cards," Ethan says to Amber. "Go on ahead." "If you insist," she replies. She stands from the bed and strides over to the stairwell, the bottom of her robe fluttering behind her. "Not hot?" Lucre asks. "A little," Amber replies with a thin grin. As she speaks, she starts to roll up her sleeves. "But last night was really cold." "Yes," Lucre nods, staring down the stairs. "The desert not hot at night. Cold helps Cerberus sleep better." Anansi is eating a piece of fruit at the table when he reaches the bottom. He gives her a smile. "I'm taking them sandboarding," he informs her. Anansi arches an eyebrow and takes another bite out of her food. "Are you sure?" "Yes, Anansi, I'll be careful with them." "And what if you're seen with them, "Anansi, what will happen when your mother finds out?" "Anansi." "Lucre?" The suddenness of his name makes him pause. Something surges up from within him, making his gut churn and his chest flutter. Her colors are bright, normally meaning urgency or seriousness or shouting. He shakes his head. "Snap out of it. Anansi, it's Anansi, not Mom. Anansi doesn't shout at you." "You know I'm only trying to look out for you," Anansi says gently, probably only because she saw the alarm on his face. "You are a free spirit. She doesn't see that. But we both want you to be safe in our own rights." Lucre nods slowly. "I know." Anansi grins at him this time. "Now, go have fun, little prince." Lucre nods again, his spirits only slightly lifted. "Thanks." "Lucre?" Amber asks behind him. "Is everything all right?" Lucre turns to her and forces a wide grin. "Yes, just talking." Amber just smiles along with him and nods. He's glad she doesn't question the matter further. Ethan comes down the stairs finally, cape around his neck and hat firmly on his head, and nods to Anassi. Morning. Anassi smiles and nods back at the wizard, the tip of her tail waving idly in the air. Lucre claps, satisfying that everyone who is joining him on his excursion today is now present, and turns around again, striding to the door. He can hear the other two following along behind him, their footsteps loud and sharp on the sandstone floor. They step outside, and Lucre takes a deep breath. The day is just starting, the sun just barely over the sands. He can't see it, for those dark clouds are in the way. But he's been awake at this time more than enough to know where it is already. He gestures for the two to follow him and starts off down the narrow alleyway that leads out to the sand plain. This time, he doesn't bother to check and make sure if the other two are following at all, rushing ahead eagerly. The sooner they are out on the sands, the longer they'll have to explore. Actually, he wants to take them over to the old ruins. He's only been a couple of times himself, but he always finds them interesting to explore. They're not too far from the town either. He stops just at the edge of the buildings and stares out at the sand plain for a moment, breathing heavily. No matter how many times he looks at it, the vastness still entrances him. Throughout most of his day, he stares at them from afar, wishing he could spend all of his free time gliding across them. Free time he doesn't have. He shakes his head and bends down. They're going to need boards. He digs his hands into the sand and slowly exhales, focusing. The moment he feels the board's cold metal in his palms, he slowly raises the board up. The last few grains drip from the metal, and he grins with satisfaction. 2 more times. The others need one too. The second one emerges from the sands. Though as Lucre stands to admire his handiwork, the blood rushes to his head, and his vision blacks out for a moment. He takes a shaky step backwards, only for someone to catch him. You all right? It's Ethan. They caught up to him finally. Yes, Lucre forces, casting the board aside. No, he's not fine. Making 2 sandboards is an effort enough without his wand. He had tried hard just to be able to make 1 without passing out. 1 more, he urges himself, feeling the hot and cold spots dance across his body chaotically. 1 more. He kneels down and digs his hands in again. The sand was warm against his skin the first time, but now it seems to burn. He narrows his eyes and focuses, exhaling slowly once again. It feels like his insides are being sucked out of him, his stomach dropping as if he were airborne. The metal brushes his fingers, and he lifts. It's heavy. He feels someone say something, for his ears vibrate with their words, but he suddenly lost all capability to hear. Black spots dance across his vision, and he barely makes out a second person. Amber, he can see her green robe, bend down next to him and also grab onto the sandboard. With her help, the board pops up, and Lucre tumbles backwards and lands on his butt. He squeezes his eyes shut for a moment and takes a series of deep breaths, collecting himself. You okay? Ethan's voice fades in. Lucre opens his eyes for a moment and sees the 2 wizards bent down in front of him. Lucre nods lazily, his neck feeling weak. Amber reaches out with a hand and places it on his arm. Her touch is cold against his, making his skin tingle uncomfortably. A burst of golden sparkles rises from her fingers. A cold yet calming energy flows from her touch, spreading up his arm to the rest of his body. Her silvery eyes are wide yet glazed, clearly concentrating. The energy reaches from toes to fingers to head. It pulses, starting from his arm and rippling outwards. His breathing, first frantic from the sudden change in his body temperature, slows down significantly. His arms begin to tremble, becoming weak and heavy. His eyes close as his body relaxes, getting ready for rest. And then the sensation drains away as Amber removes her hand. He blinks a couple of times and turns back to the two wizards. "He's okay," Amber says, mainly to Ethan. "He just needed some magic." Lucre stares at her in confusion. Did she give him some of her magic? Is that what the coldness was? She grins softly back at him. "How do you feel?" "Better," he breathes. He pushes himself off his arms so that he's leaning forward, folding his legs underneath him. Amber puts a hand on his arm and helps to steady him as he stands. He gives her a weak smile. "Thank you." He puts a foot forward in the direction of the sandboards. "Come on." He steps on one and bounces off, turning to check on the other two. Ethan is helping Amber with hers, teaching her as Lucre taught him yesterday. The sight makes him smile. With the two wizards comfortably on their boards, they start off, Lucre leading the way. With it being so early in the morning, very few Cerberus are awake, and pretty much no one riding just yet. The perfect time to sneak off. They leave the plain behind, weaving in and out of the dunes. Lucre spreads his arms wide and tilts his head back to face the sky. He feels his board rise and fall underneath him, letting the dunes take over for him. "You were right, Eth!" Amber shouts somewhere behind him. "This is fun!" "So, are we just out for a ride?" Ethan asks loudly. Lucre glances behind him with a smile. "Old ruins!" Ethan scowls in confusion. "What?" "You will see!" The group continues on in silence after that. Lucre is just happy to have the company. He's not really met many people. He's hardly allowed to run around on his own, let alone sandboard. It's unfortunate he can only explore during the early morning. Besides, the two wizards have been nothing but nice to him. Maybe Mom was wrong about them. Finally, they ride over a dune, and Lucre points. "There!" Ahead, hidden between the dunes, are a collection of sand-covered buildings. The place is much bigger than his town, much bigger, with the old palace standing over the buildings, as if waiting for its previous inhabitants to return. He hears Amber gasp behind him. "Wow!" "Amazing," Ethan agrees. The three ride up to the main street and stop. The street is wide and covered with small stone squares, many already half buried in sand. Woven coverings are still, some with holes in them. Rugs are also covered in sand, their color faded and the fabric scratched. Lucre's town has somewhat of the same setup. The main street, where a lot of trade and distribution happens, cuts the town in half. In the center of town, which he can also see in the distance, is a water basin, where the pellets are kept. However, his always remains fully stocked. Here, it is only full of fine yellow-orange grains. "Old ruins," he says, waving a hand out over the desolate stalls, abandoned buildings, and run-down palace. They walk down the street slowly. Lucre keeps an eye on the wizards, who stare at their surroundings in awe. "This place is huge," Amber marvels. "And you can see the palace from here," Ethan nods. "Why can't we see it at the other town?" "Palace... kind of far," Lucre admits. "Was better that way?" "You're in a desert," Amber points out. Lucre just shrugs. "I didn't build it." Honestly, he doesn't exactly know why the palace is so far from town. It was built there generations ago, long before his mother was ever born. But no one complained about it, so there it stayed. "Why did you leave this place behind?" Ethan inquires. "Palace." Lucre gestures to the palace. "Protect spring. Spring dried up. We were forced to move. Other spring is far away, so we rebuilt. Royals in charge of protecting spring. Good fighters. Good rulers. People have right to overthrow if royals are unfair, too. Guards only meant to slow intruders. Royals are last to fall. At least, that is how they are seen." Lucre lets out a huff. "Stories are told of many royals. Some felled in battle, some fending off entire armies, some masters of the sands." He trails off. Will he ever get to be like his ancestors? "Is something wrong?" Amber asks. Lucre forces a smile and shakes his head. "Good. Want to see inside?" Amber's eyes sparkle with eagerness. "I'm sure it's massive in there. Have you been inside?" Lucre shakes his head again, though his excitement rises with hers. "Nope. Let's go." He and Amber break into a sprint, laughing the entire way. They weave around the empty water basin and streak past the empty buildings. Suddenly, Ethan appears, running up next to them. Something bright flashes from his arms in long, jagged strings. He has a determined grin on his face, eyes on the palace gates ahead of him. His cape flutters behind him as he goes, almost looking like it's waving at him. Slowly, he pulls ahead, leaving Lucre and Amber in his dust. "No fair!" Amber calls after him. "Nothing's fair," he replies over his shoulder. Though it's said in a playful tone, the glimpse Lucre gets at his face tells another story. It's dead straight, the grin from earlier wiped clean off. He gets a sinking feeling that there's more to that statement than Ethan's letting on. "Between us," Lucre breathes at her. She smiles back at him. "Agreed." The two continue, both exchanging first and second. Lucre feels exhilarated with the experience, alongside his growing tiredness. He's never been in a race before. Maybe against himself, but those races are no fun. Is this what it's like to compete with someone else? The two reach the gate, made of large black iron bars, and collapse to the floor. Ethan waits for them to catch their breaths, casually leaning against the gate with his arms folded. He looks on like he is somehow in charge of watching after them. "Who won?" Lucre asks between breaths. Ethan shrugs. "You two were pretty neck and neck." "Tie?" Amber suggests. Lucre nods along. "Sure. Even if they both won, he still had fun." The two pick themselves up and brush themselves off. Then the three turn to the gate. "It's closed," Amber mutters downheartedly. "Why, I've not been inside," Lucre admits sheepishly. Ethan rubs his hands together. "Shouldn't be much of a problem. Spirit of ice!" The temperature around them drops, almost making Lucre shiver. Mist rolls from Ethan's arms this time. He seems completely fine with it, unlike Amber, who hugs her arms close to her chest and seems to shake. He raises his arms high, then slams his hands down on the ground. Something blue-white spreads from his fingers, shooting out across the ground, and stopping just briefly under the gate. Then there's a burst, and two glittering pillars shoot up from the places where the whatever it is stopped. The pillars take the gate up with it, and hold it in place, high in the air. What? Lucre gasps. Ethan turns to him, his lips pursed. He points to the pillars and asks, "Never seen ice before?" Lucre shakes his head. "It's like solid water." "Oh! Imagine what his people could do if they had ice." "Well, After you. Ethan steps aside and waves the other two onward. Amber giggles and starts forward, walking between the ice pillars without issue. Lucre approaches one of the pillars and pauses. He can feel the coldness radiating from it, akin only to the chill of the night air. Slowly, he reaches out to touch it. Only for a moment, for he just as quickly reels away from it. The ice is so cold that it burned his fingers. He shoves his hand into his mouth and lets out a relieved sigh. Yeah, it's cold all right, Ethan says next to him, staring up at his handiwork. Do all wizards have ice? He asks. Ethan smiles and shakes his head. No, not every wizard, but there are a lot that do. You? I'm a death wizard. I can talk to the dead and use their magic for a short time. Amber, he points to the distant girl ahead of them, is a life wizard. Her job is healing others and growing plants. Ah, we have life wizards too, Lucre replies, removing his hand from his mouth. They do same as her. I figured, Ethan hums. Now, come on, let's not spend our time standing around all day. Ethan walks through the pillars as well, hands slipping into his pockets. Lucre runs after him. He pretty much forgot that he doesn't have much time with them out here already. Beyond the gate is the garden. Well, it was the garden. Now it's just sand and small patches of dead dirt. The gray stone pathway remains mostly intact, however. Even after all this time, the cut squares are still even. Amber waits for them at the large front door. The other palace hardly has a door of the same size, or a garden as large as what this once was. You two took your time, she comments. Some being was admiring the ice, Ethan replies, jabbing a thumb at Lucre. Hey! Lucre exclaims in irritation. That's okay, Amber chuckles. She turns to the door, one hand resting on the aged wood. With seemingly little effort, she pushes one half of the door open and peers inside. A quick moment later, she lets out a surprised gasp, one hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Ethan peers through the gap and also pauses, his body tensing. His face holds no expression. What? Lucre asks innocently, trying to see past the two. Ethan turns to him and shakes his head. I don't think you want to. Anger rises inside Lucre. I want to see. He pushes Ethan out of the way, and the wizards stumble aside in surprise. Maybe he shouldn't have done that. His eyes widen at the sight. The main hall, it's the same as the other palace, where one is led directly to the throne room, is dark, yet he can see what the other two probably already saw. A body. Its skin is withered, tail shrunk to just barely a sliver, gray and rotting scales littering the floor around it. Mouth agape in a silent scream. Its eyes are lifeless black sockets. It wears chain armor, much like what the guards he knows wears. Its hands are outstretched, as if it were trying to crawl away. And a silver spear pierces its torso, sticking upwards like a sort of marker. What? He breathes aloud. Without thinking, his legs take him inside the main hall. More guard bodies litter the ground, leading up to the throne. It's made of gold, or what he assumes to be gold, as it shines with what little light there is. All are impaled with either a spear or a long sword. The king is even still sitting on his throne, a spear through where his heart once was. A circlet atop his skeletal head tells Lucre as much. It's silver, with a large faded blue water pellet inlaid in its center, between two open snake mouths. Tattered green cloth lay on the corpse's shoulders, quite possibly a magnificent robe at some point. He ignores the other bodies around him, maybe 15 in total, and walks right up to the throne. The king's empty eyes stare back at him. The circlet glimmers before him. The king's circlet. Cerberus, he speaks aloud, his voice echoing around the empty hall, addressing the wizards whom he knows have already stepped inside after him. Are ruled by queens. We have one crown. He hesitates. He shouldn't out himself. It could put him in danger, even if he's in the presence of those he considers to be his friends. They're wizards, for ancestors' sake. They can turn on him whenever they want. And yet, I am only heir to our throne. But Mom will have me marry. Wife will be crowned. She's supposed to know everything. But that is me. I know everything. And I won't even rule. I was never told. He shakes his head, his voice catching. Slowly, he reaches for the king's circlet and plucks it off the corpse's head. He holds it in his hands delicately, as if it were to break at any moment from any applied force. I was lied to. All his life, he had been told that kings had never ruled, that the king was considered weak and selfish, that the king was only meant as a figurehead, a half to make a whole. A queen cannot sit alone, but a king cannot direct the people. And yet he was taught how to be a queen. He hated every moment. It's why he sneaks out and sandboards, to give himself a small sense of freedom and carelessness. That his life isn't all palace walls and an impending marriage ceremony. He doesn't even want to... He doesn't even know what his people think of him. They hardly see him, just as he hardly sees them. How much of their known history has been made up? How much has he been lied to? He doesn't even know what happened here. A battle, sure, that's clear enough. But why, and who did it, and when? Is this why the king stopped ruling? Was it something he did? Whoever this dead king was? First it was wizards. Now it's kings. Tears sting his eyes, still staring at the circlet. It's a relieving, confusing, sickening sight, reminding him of his mother's golden circlet she always wears. A circlet he was never going to get. He still can't believe it. He thought this was going to be a fun morning, exploring the old palace and getting to know the wizards more. And yet there wasn't really a way to prepare for all this. He didn't even know it was here. 2 hands are placed, one on each of his shoulders, one for each wizard. Lucre sniffs and looks at the 2, Amber on his left and Ethan on his right. Sorry, he whimpers. It's only natural, Ethan replies calmly. Amber just smiles, appearing to be feeling the same sadness as Lucre, though probably for different reasons. Ethan turns to look at the rest of the body-littered hall and says, "These poor souls, we should put them to rest." Amber nods and appears to swallow hard. But how? Well, first we need to remove those weapons. Not completely. I'm sure it's there. I'm sure some are so old they'll break right off. Just as much as we can. Why? Lucre asks quietly. Well, Ethan hums, it's more out of respect. Do you not honor your dead? We do, Lucre stammers. Indeed, they have ceremonies for those who are passing, have passed, and will pass, as well as for the ancestors of old. Sorry. To free up his hands, he puts the cold circlet on his head as he makes his way back down the steps that lead up to the throne. The circlet remains perfectly balanced as he looks down to watch his feet as he descends. He passes Amber on the way, who is yanking a spear from the nearest body. The shaft breaks, leaving the tip still impaled in the body. With a sigh, she casts the shaft away, and it clatters on the floor loudly. Lucre approaches a guard with a sword stuck in their chest. Ancestors honor you for your sacrifice, he says, though there is no Cerberus around to read it. He grabs the hilt and tugs. There's a very audible snap, and the blade comes free. Well, most of it. There's a clean diagonal cut across the middle of the blade. Clearly, there's still some sword inside the corpse, but the smell of the corpse hits his nose, an age and putrid rot only released by the disturbance of the broken sword, and he resists the overwhelming urge to vomit. He does step backwards a good distance before doubling over, a hand over his mouth and other over his nose. He doesn't look forward to the next corpse he has to tend to, and yet a king's gotta do what a king's gotta do. He collects himself and puffs out his chest to encourage confidence, approaching the next dead Cerberus. This one has a spear. He grabs the shaft and pulls with all his might. After one or two good attempts, he lets out a few huffs and shakes his head. This one is in deep. Readjusting his grip and carefully placing a sandal on the corpse's back, he tries again, leaning into the pull with all his might. He feels the weapon begin to slide free. Once again, he pulls with his entire body. There's more of a jolt this time, the spear almost popping right out. He straightens himself and gives it a fifth try. Ah! He exclaims in surprise as the spear suddenly flies free. The tip is still on and everything. He backs away from the corpse before the smell has a chance to reach his nose and inspects the weapon. Shockingly, it's in relatively good condition. The tip is a little chipped and there's a slight fracture in the shaft, but otherwise it seems to not be as time-touched as some of the other weapons appear. Nothing a little love and attention couldn't fix. This one is good, he says, mainly showing the spear to Amber. She drops the half of a sword she holds as she stares at the weapon he presents to her. That's surprising, she replies, gesturing to a trail of discarded weaponry left in her wake. Everything I've pulled out so far has shattered beyond repair. I'm lucky, Lucre boasts simply. He twirls the spear in his hand and jabs at the air a couple times. Not only is it light like sand, but it moves through the air with ease. Yes, it's a good weapon, all right. Whoever made it knew their craft very well. Maybe he'll keep it, just as a keepsake. He carries the spear around with him as he pulls out more half-broken weapons from bodies. He gives some of them prayer, like the first one he went to, but not all. He doesn't want to make himself sick of saying it. At least, he's kind of doing what Ethan said, respecting some of the dead, at least. Rest in peace, Amber mutters, retrieving the last broken spear from the final body. The two stand together and stare at the amount of weaponry they had removed. That's a lot, she comments. Lucre nods. Yes, maybe it can be used again. I think you'll be asked where you got all this from, she replies, gesturing around the hall. Ah, true. He doesn't even know what he'll say if he were asked. Maybe leave, then. For now. I agree. The two approach Ethan, who observes from the dais the throne sits on. You didn't even help, Amber pouts. Ethan smiles back at her. Don't worry, I had some preparation to do of my own. Amber makes a small tisk noise and folds her arms. Ethan rolls his eyes, then turns to Lucre. I wanted to do this one with you. He waves to the king. Lucre nods in agreement. He would like to pay his respects to his ancestor, whoever he may be. You can wait outside if you'd like, Amber. Amber nods. I'll give you two space. Lucre, I can hold that for you. Lucre passes her his new spear. Thank you. The two boys watch her walk among the dead and eventually exit through the big front door, her pink hair waving at them before completely disappearing from view. Ethan lets out a deep sigh and turns to the body. The weapon first. Right. Lucre steps forward and grips the spear shaft. He takes a breath, mustering his strength, and gives the weapon a yank. It comes clean out, tip and everything, though the damage is clear. The shaft around the spear tip is already cracked through and splintering, and the tip itself is flat, having been smashed into solid metal. No good, he mutters, mostly to himself, as he casts the spear carelessly aside. It bounces down the steps, the tip separating from the shaft along the cracks as it goes. It takes a good, long moment for the spear's metallic ringing to fade away. Press your palms together, like this. Ethan presses his palms together, holding his hands at chest level. Wordlessly, Lucre does the same. The two turn their attention to the dead royal before them. Try and repeat after me. It's okay if you get some of the words wrong. O spirit, though death was not yours to choose, we release you, to unite with your loved ones in the white beyond, and to have your story be told for generations to come, to never be forgotten, and to live on eternally. Rest peacefully. Lucre closes his eyes and does his best to repeat, but some of the words come out a little slurred. However, he pushes through to the end. When he opens his eyes, he sees the royal's body erupt into rich purple sparkles, fading away. It's not long before the throne sits empty. Lucre drops his hands to his sides and lets out a heavy sigh. Ethan places a hand on his shoulder. A lot to take in? He asks. Lucre nods. Many questions. The wizard pats his shoulder, then turns to stare out at the rest of the hall again. This will take a while, he says. Why don't you wait outside with Amber? Get some fresh air. Lucre nods slowly. He'll come back in anyway. There's still more to explore after all. He steps down from the dais and trudges to the door, keeping his head high so as not to look at the dead around him. The circlet on his head grows cold, reminding him of its presence. How long has such an item been sitting here for? And, more importantly, why? And that is where we will stop for today. and we will finish the second half of the second act on Saturday. But until then, now it is Q&A time. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. There are a couple things that I do want to comment on myself, though. One of which being the palace in the ruined town is actually a holdover from the old manuscript. This used to be the original setting for the Mirage scene, but then I decided to change it because it was like, well, with how the Cerberus are with their current issues and stuff, it wouldn't make sense for them to be living in such a large town with such a large palace. But I didn't want to just scrap the setting, so it became the old ruins. And the town and the new palace, they're somewhere else. You might want to describe how Ethan works, like his brain and age. Okay, so as mentioned in these chapters, Ethan is quite old. He is the half sibling of the Spirit of Shadow, who is basically one of the two gods that created the universe. Ethan himself, he's only 1800 years old. But Shadow, whom he belongs to, Shadow's much, 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 much older than that. It's been around for quite a while. But like Ethan mentioned, he hasn't been around for that long. Like, he hasn't seen the Great War. His other siblings have, but Ethan and Shadow, they haven't. So all that they know about the Great War is from what they've been told by their father, the Spirit of Shadow, and what they have been able to read in the Library of Asandra. And, of course, from talking with the spirits and stuff like that. So, everything they know, it's all hearsay, but it's mostly accurate. I'd say like 95% of all the information that Ethan knows about the Great War is accurate. Yeah, and I guess I could say that the Great War is kind of partly a fascination for Ethan. I don't know if you guys remember in Act 1, Ethan recommends a book to Amber called The Last King of Corodon. He really likes that book. he that's his favorite book. Fun fact. But he's read a lot of obscure books like that. Just because he wants to know about history. And since he's so young, he is the youngest out of all the fragments. Because he's so young, there's a lot that he needs to catch up on. What went into creating Lucre, and was it hard making his character lines when he only says little English? Um, Ooh. So Lucre was born out of a need, like in the really old version when it was still fan fiction. He was born more out of a need to be a companion for Amber, as well as, I guess, a love interest at some point. Like, he didn't start as a love interest, but then it kind of developed into that, like, half brother slash love interest. And then there was the love triangle, and now it's not like that anymore. He's more of just a friend. Um, but I think, like I mentioned in one of the previous Q&As, Lucre is inspired by this, like, the snake mobs from Mirage in Wizard 101, but a little bit more humanoid. Like a Nassie, he can turn his legs into a tail at will. Actually, all Cerberus are born with tails. The legs, they could turn their tails into legs. And that's just from the Cerberus and wizards having relations over the many, many millennia before, of course, Mirage was closed off to the rest of Astria. As for writing his lines, it wasn't as hard as you might think. Like, it. What I did was I wrote it out first in, like, his own voice. Like, this is what I want him to say. And then I would go back and I would say, how would he phrase it? This is what he wants to say, but how will he phrase it? And it's like, well, when you first meet him, like in these couple of chapters, yeah, his spoken is terrible because he's almost never had to use it. So it's like, it's a lot of short sentences, single words, double words, and it has to be very, straight and to the point. And then as he warms up, he starts branching out into more complex sentences. If he needs to actually speak properly, he needs to slow down and take his time. Of course, he's gonna stutter because he doesn't really know how to say certain things, like mysterious and Amber's name. He had to spell it out beforehand before, being confident in saying it. So it was just kind of like playing around with the wording and the phrasing and how he would have said stuff versus, Ethan and Amber. And it made for a fun time actually writing his dialogue, because beforehand, in the old draft, he didn't speak like this. He was like, from the get-go, very proper, very well-spoken, because he spoke a lot with his mother, and he still kind of does, but not as much anymore. And then I showed that draft to my parents, my dad specifically, and he went through and wrote a bunch of notes. He really helped me turn Shadowbound into what the book is now, the current published version. And he was like, well, this, you say that the Cerberus have been closed off to the rest of Astria, and they can also see heat, so why not have them speak through body heat, because, they're snakes, if they can see and regulate their own body heat. Because, talking a lot dries you out, which, give me one moment, I'm gonna take a sip of water. And since they live in a desert and they only have like one water supply, then it wouldn't make sense for them to talk a whole lot. And I was like, you have a good point. You're right. I'm going to play around with that. And then that's how I got Lucre how he is now. And in the second book, he's going to be talking for the most part like everyone else, because, by that point he's had that time to warm up. But for now, you get to see him learn how to speak again. Would you like to join my server? I could promote your live streams in my promo channel. You can promote my streams if you'd like anyway. I don't have to be in the server. Um, I might need to talk to you later about that though. Now is not really the best time to be discussing that. What characters underwent the most rewrites? Probably Lucre. And oh, also his name wasn't always Lucre. It used to be Luke, and then it's like, well, that's kind of too basic for a sand kid, so it's Lucre now, and Luke is his nickname. He underwent the most changes. Because I don't know if y'all picked up on it, but he is the current Prince of Mirage. Just, for clarity's sake, to make sure we're all on the same page there. He is the current prince, and he used to be a major asshole. He was so pompous, but he still snuck out and did sandboarding stuff because his mom was also super strict and didn't want him leaving. So not only was he mean, but he was also a little rebellious. And then over time, his personality softened up, and now he's like this, as you see him in Shadowbound. He's a lot more friendly, a lot more curious, a lot more inquisitive, humble, still a little rebellious because he's still sneaking out. But that's always been part of his character, so that really hasn't changed much. Now he's a softie, and I prefer this version of Lucre. Yes, you really don't want to see the old Lucre. You'd be like, wait, that's him? That's what he used to be? How could you have done this to my boy? No! Like, even I'm mad at myself, but that was just how things started, and first drafts versus final drafts are so incredibly different. Storm said he's too well spoken, time to nerf him. Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. I mean, if you don't speak a whole lot, then I would imagine you would sound the same way. I mean, that, and also your voice would be a little bit more because you just haven't used your vocal cords a whole lot either. I mean, he still makes sure, like, he does vocal exercises and stuff to make sure that doesn't happen, but, it's, he must relearn how to sentence. What member of the main crew did you like to write the most? That is hard to say. Probably this new version of Luke. Like, he was the best. Just because I was really excited to try out the new speech pattern, and I think it came out really well. And I'm glad you guys seem to like it too. It makes him quirky, and every character needs a quirk. Ethan's an immortal being, Amber's a regular girl, and Lucre can't speak. It's perfect. The best characters are infuriating to even the authors. They can be, yeah. Of course, it all depends. And it's all in service of the higher calling, which is writing a good story, hopefully. Because if you're writing bad stories, then I don't know. I don't know what you're doing. Lucre finding out about other languages would be a fun short. Oh man. Oh man. No, no, don't tell him that there are other languages. He'll die. I just learned how to talk, and now you're telling me that there's something called French. I can't even. Can't even. Because, talking with the body heat, how they do, that in and of itself is a language. I mean, not Not a whole lot to learn there. Like, by the other races because they don't have that same ability. But, it's like there's the body heat, there's spoken, and then in spoken there's like so many subsets. But not in Astria. Astria, it's a pretty universal language. Lucre having an existential crisis over learning there's more than one language. Exactly. I don't think he would handle that very well. He'd probably just agree to stay home and not leave the palace ever again. There's more than one language? Okay, I'm done. Goodbye. Let's just close Mirage again. Come back when you have universalized your language. And another thing that I wanted to comment on last time, but then it totally slipped my brain, was Kimberly's crystal ball. That too is a holdover from the previous draft, because in that draft, everyone had a crystal ball, and that was like their telephone system. And I removed that. But also in that previous draft, um, like that led into the first draft of the next book, where Lucre actually gets a crystal ball. He doesn't anymore, but he he liked to kick that around. Anyway, that was just a small little tidbit of like, she has a there's a lot of little things left over from the first draft of Shadowbound that you may or may not notice because they're such small details, but they're also such random details too. So some of them are a little bit more obvious than others. But I like her having a crystal ball, so that ain't gonna change. I thought that was funny because even I forgot about the crystal ball being there, to be honest. Hola, Luke. What's that? Spanish. It's another language. There's more! Oh no! Don't even start! Well, I'm glad you all like Lucre, even for his very late introduction. I know he's kind of teased on the back of the book already, but, he's always been part of the story. It's just, Asandra is where all the setup happens, and he doesn't live there, so obviously we can't really set him up in Asandra too well. think I think that was probably my biggest challenge, or one of my biggest challenges with Shadowbound, was trying to introduce Lucre in a way that felt natural and that would get the audience, to fall in love with him in one way or another. To either, love him for the being he is or hate him because I don't know why you would hate him. But, get the audience emotionally invested in him, even though you're like 14 chapters in by that point, and it's like, wait, there's a new character being introduced? Uh huh. Yeah, and he's great. So I think the interesting speech pattern helped. What do you guys think? Another bean? Oh boy, there are so many beans! But he's more snake than bean. He's a green bean. A long bean. Bean, not breen. Speech pattern helps. Okay, good to know. Good to know I'm doing things right. Okay, Echo. I was surprised about his speech pattern, but it makes sense. It gives Lucre almost a childlike presence, IMO. Yes, that's what I've heard from other people too. It's like, um, it's easy for them to forget that he's like, I think he's 18 because of the way he speaks. You know, like the way he speaks, he sounds like he's 6 or 7, but no, he's almost an adult. Yeah, he is 18 because Amber's 16. And Ethan is just way out there. Though, in Fragment Shadow Years, Ethan is actually like around toddler age, but that's just his frame of time. Main cast is poorly drawn beans. Maybe if Echo has the time to do that. Still saying you might want to explain their ages. Oh, yeah. Endgame ships and all. Fair enough. Yeah, so Amber's 16. Luke and Jake, they're 18. And so is Blaze. Kimberly is 20. And Ethan is 1,800. Ethan is too old for Amber shippers. Got it. Well, yes. Like as an actual number, he's really old. Mentally though, he's kind of young. It's like he's like a preteen stuck in a teen's body while being the age of God or whatever. Yeah. 12. Not 2. 2 would imply that he was just a baby, not knowing what's going on. No! 16, 18, 18, 18, 20, and 1,800. Yep. Pretty much. I mean, to wizards, they get to be. I want to say the average lifespan of a wizard is about like 5 centuries. I mean, they can go on to be much older than that if they want, but 5 centuries is usually when they get bored. So they all live a fairly long time. I think Cerberus only lived to like 350 to 400 years, and then they actually die. Uh, yeah, so the time in Astria is extremely skewed just because of everyone's lifespans being so long. Which is also why there's, like, not really a proper unit of time measurement, at least for the wizards. Like, the Cerberus, they keep track of the time only a little bit better than the wizards, though not by much. There is like a dating system and a time system, but it's not important. Like it's so niche that they don't it like no one really knows it by heart. Oh, I think Echo's done drawing. If you're done, then you can just leave the picture up for people to admire. And you could take a break. Thank you, though. Everyone say thank you to Echo. She works really hard to draw these pictures for all y'all so that you have something to look at while I'm writing. Writing? Reading. Bruh, why am I not living 5 centuries? Well, humans are a little different than wizards. We may look like wizards, but their physiology is different. Probably because of all the magic, too. Like, we don't have magic like them, so. If Shadowbound takes place in 2023, Ethan has been around since the year 223 CE. Yeah. Like, Astria is about as old, if not older, than Earth. Because they were, or at least, you know, in their um, fables and history and stuff, Astria was the first planet ever made. And then everything else kind of came after that. Though, keeping dates correct, like when you need to actually pay attention to them, is really hard. And I know that because of a different project that I've been working on and off for a while. And just trying to keep all the dates straight has been a nightmare. So, with Astria and with everything happening over a long period of time, I just decided not to date anything. Because it's like, well, then I'm assigning dates to stuff, and then I need to make sure that they're all consistent, and maybe not. Which is why people don't really remember how long ago the Great War happened. Because even I don't really want to settle on a date for that. You know, big event, big waves through history. It's enough that they continue to remember it even to the modern day. Because wizards hold grudges like that. My favorite's gotta be Jake and Lucre. Yeah, they're fun. They're two very fun characters. Before humans existed anyhow. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, if anyone has any more questions, now's the time to ask. I think I'll take maybe 2 or 3 more. There will be a reading on Saturday, the 13th, if you are watching this live. If you are watching this in the future, hello. But if you're watching this live, we will be reading again on Saturday, the 13th. Also, as a reminder, all the recordings past Chapter 7, they're going to be available to channel members when the Shadowbound sequel is published. So for now, all of the readings will be free, but when the second book is published, the Chapter 7 and beyond, they will be available to channel members only, and channel membership's only $3. So for $3, you'll be able to listen to the entirety of my reading of Shadowbound and also of all of my future books that I wind up publishing eventually. Is mayonnaise an instrument? No, Patrick, mayonnaise is not an instrument. And if you are enjoying these readings and, don't own a copy of Shadowbound yourself, but would like to get yourself a copy, a quick reminder that there is a link to the Amazon store page in the description below or in the pinned chat message. Ah, yes. Does anyone have any predictions or theories? Because now we know what Ethan is, and Jake, or not Jake, Luke. Sorry, I'm getting them mixed up. Lukery. Yes. Jake's here. Lukery is just Jake in disguise. Oh no. Oh, and, like I said in the beginning, if you want to read about the Great War, I am writing that on my Substack, and there should be a link to my Substack in the description below as well. If you would like to learn a little bit about Astria's history and the greatest moment in its history so far. You thought it was Lucre, but it was me, Jake. Surprise, Jake incoming. Not incoming, but Yeah, but you don't even know Ethan's full story either. You have just scratched the surface, and more will be revealed next time. Well, uh, if there's one more question, I'll take it. Any other comments? Feel free to get those out now. Because I think this is the end of this Q&A. Yes, right when you're shading, Echo. I'm so sorry. But the picture does look great. Thank you. All right. So, I guess Ethan is jaded out while having lived 1800 years. He's probably seen a lot of death. Oh, yeah, he's seen more than his fair share of it. Absolutely. And especially being um a death wizard, or at least studying death. Yeah. I mean, it kind of comes with the territory a little. Being an immortal figure, people come and go, and then also being a death wizard, you get to talk to the dead too. But what matters is how, I guess, you frame it. Like, if you let it get you down every time, then it's going to be hard to move on. But, the more you see it, like, sure, you get desensitized to it over time, but I feel like you'd also find a way to find your own peace of mind. Anyway, yeah, I think I'll call it here. So thank you all for coming to this reading. I will see you again in the next one. Thank you to Echo for providing the entertainment, as always. Have a good time zone and drink water.